Welcome to Coffee and Conversation. My name is Chuck Adams, and today we'll be talking about winning patients beyond the console. Our guest today started his sales career with IBM and later served as the Global Account Director for Intel. In 2014, he left the corporate world and started his sales consulting career and has worked with well-known global brands such as Adobe, BMW, and Google. In early 2019, he refocused his consulting business to help aesthetic practices grow revenue by converting more leads to patients through ethical sales process development. Chris Stock, founder and CEO of SalesMD, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Chuck. It's good to be here.
Absolutely, Chris. Welcome to Coffee and Conversation. I've got a lot I want to chat with you about today, but before we dive in, it's not often that we have a guest on the program whose first job was a ski instructor in the French Alps. Tell us a little bit about that experience.
It's actually a good place to start. So my mum took me skiing when I was 14 and incredibly privileged to have that experience. Absolutely love it. Fell in love with the sport. I think I was about 19 and I sort of declared that I wasn't going to go to university. I felt I wanted to do something different. I'd come back to education and do my MBA later on, but at the time I wanted to do something else. So my mother said to me, if you're not going to be in full-time education, you're paying for your own skiing holiday. And at that point, you realize how expensive skiing holidays or vacations are. And I thought, I'm going skiing. How am I going to do this? So I became a ski instructor and got a job in the Alps. I said to my parents, I'm going away for 6 months and came back 5 years later. So it was a phenomenal experience. And without being cliche, but I do sort of say I went away a boy and came back a man, and just in my maturity and sort of life and experiences. So that was the start of my career.
Well, that's a pretty awesome first job for sure. Chris, I know that at SalesMD you work primarily with aesthetic practices, plastic surgeons, med spas, and really in that space, winning new patients starts with winning the consult. I'm curious, what are some of the challenges you see in practices when it comes to actually booking a consult?
I think fundamentally, in the practice I've worked for, the staff are very caring. They've chosen this profession because it is a wonderful profession to be in, and by nature they're very caring. What that means though is they're not following sort of what I would call a process, the sales process. And for me, sales is not about selling you something that you don't want. It's about fundamentally really understanding that person, that patient. And so I think some of the challenges that I then see is, sometimes we don't always listen to the patient fully. Even in that first phone call, we're not really engaging with them emotionally. We're not asking questions. We're not getting below the surface. And we're missing huge opportunities. And as I say, this is not about selling something they don't want. It's about maximizing, that opportunity for the practice, but also being of true service to the patients and really sort of taking that time to understand what's important to them. And I think part of this is, again, the challenges for the practice. We've been through this conversation hundreds of times. We've seen hundreds of patients, but for the individual phoning in, it's probably the first time for them with you, and it could be the first time ever to sort of explore, this sort of treatment, plastic surgery, etc. So I think it really is important to understand this is their first time, and let's really engage with them. And I think that's where that first sort of challenge is. That's the first challenge I see in that sort of process.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. There's a lot of there's an emotional decision that typically happens when someone is calling to schedule a consult with an aesthetic practice. And I think being able to listen and understand what that prospective patient is wanting to accomplish can certainly make a really big impact on how they ultimately move through that process with the practice.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, no doubt. So at a practice, once they've won and actually executed, scheduled, and then held that consultation, they really need to be able to advance that patient to a procedure. And sometimes that can be something that happens fairly quickly, and sometimes it takes some time to get there for a whole host of reasons. What are some of the common challenges that you see during this phase of the process with aesthetic practices, really moving from the consult ultimately to booking a procedure?
The piece that I see here, and I think it's actually very unique, coming from the corporate sales world, we often talked about team selling, and I think it was something we dreamed of, where everyone that was touching the customer was involved in the process. Actually, within a practice, a medical practice, it is team selling from that first phone call. So the receptionist needs to be involved, the patient care coordinator, the provider, the nurse, and the surgeon themselves. It really is sort of a team sales process, a team consult process. And so one of the things I do notice is, and again, this is not detracting from the expertise and the wonderful people, but there are two processes going on. There is this sort of the commercial side, and then there's the medical side, and sometimes they feel quite disjointed. And I've experienced, I've mystery shopped, and sometimes you can feel we're going to be taken back to that room, and then the sales piece starts. It's where we discuss the quotation, the pricing, and scheduling. And it does feel you're building up to this. I know what's coming next, and then suddenly it feels salesy. I don't want to be sold to. No one wants to be sold to, and we're in that sort of, oh, let me think about it. Let me go away, because we don't want to be pressurized. This is too emotional, too important for it to be a sales process. And so we need to sort of join those two pieces up so it becomes seamless. People think because I've spent 30 years in sales, I'm going to be selling you whatever I can at every opportunity. And it's not. It's about being of service. And that's again why I started sales, or we started Sales MD proactively early 2019, but we were introduced into this business, into this industry in 2017. And I fell in love with it in terms of, the practices are full of good people wanting to do good things. I had a surgeon recently said, he sells hope, and it's lovely. So we need to sort of connect the medical side with that process side, take out the sales piece, and actually do it better. So for the patient, they don't feel it, they don't experience it, they just fall in love with everything about the place.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. A couple of things you said really resonate. The team selling part, we look at it here at Bell the same way, that it doesn't matter your role, whether you're a digital consultant or you work in our content team, PPC team. Everybody's in sales, because it's all around the experience that you ultimately deliver is what really kind of takes the sales out of the sales process. Do you agree with that?
Yeah. And I think I totally agree. It's and I think it's even more prevalent in a practice, insofar as the receptionists, the patient care coordinators, the nurses, the surgeons, the providers, none of them chose this career to be salespeople. It's the last thing on their agenda was, I'm going to be involved in sales. And they are, that they are all involved. And so we have to recognize that we need to help them understand the process, but without being salesy. And actually, one of the things I always say is, if you don't learn how to sell professionally, you actually fall into all the bad habits, bad tricks of an unexperienced salesperson. So the person you don't want to be, you become when you're not trained how to do it. So it's a bit ironic, really.
Yeah, certainly being able to sell, it's certainly in this environment, really just boils down to listening and trying to understand the needs and be able to meet those needs. Let me ask you this. What are some things that practices should start doing today to ultimately improve their consult to procedure conversion rates?
So it's interesting you say listening, and I totally agree. If you look at the academic studies in this area, there are two things that separate the best salespeople from everybody else. And it's a question I often ask, and you get lots of varying answers, but it comes down to the ability to ask impactful questions and the ability to listen. And so actually, if there's one thing to really start doing is start asking more questions, start asking questions that start to sort of involve that individual emotionally rather than factually. And again, I've seen it where we've sort of, it could be sort of patient coming in for breast aug, and we're getting into the facts in terms of, have you had children? How many did you breastfeed? It all becomes very matter of fact. Absolutely, we need to understand those, that information medically. We need it, but there's not the emotional connection, and therefore we need to add the other questions in. Is what are you hoping to achieve? What brought you here? And sort of again coming back to that, doctors sell that hope in terms of, yes, there's some facts that we need, but let's engage with them emotionally as well. We do that through asking great questions and then listening. And then the other piece, I think, is start telling stories. People can emotionally connect with stories. So if there's something to do today, yes, listen, start asking more questions, be more inquisitive, really start understanding who they are, and then share your experiences from the heart in terms of your journey, because people relate to stories, and that helps us to emotionally connect with that person.
Yeah. I know I work with, certainly on our team, a lot of professional sellers, and one of the challenges that even the most experienced sales people that we work with still struggle with, and that's asking for the next step. Is that something that you see with aesthetic practices as well?
The challenge is we have fear, which is good. And when we ask for the next step, we run the risk of receiving a no. No is rejection. We take it personally. Suddenly it's not about the practice or the procedure or anything else. It's about they've said no to me. And so we protect ourselves, and we don't want to put ourselves in that position. So by not asking, to move forward, we're not getting a no, we're just not getting a yes either. The other thing that I remember selling a training program to the HR director of Airbus. Actually, it's a division of Airbus, but people wouldn't know Airbus, they wouldn't know the other company. But I was in the conversation, and I've really got it correct. I'd asked good questions, everything flowed beautifully. And then the HR director turned around and said, okay, so what's your calendar look like? When can we do this? And I smiled, and she said to me, why am I smiling? I said, well, that's the salesperson's question, is when do we do this? And it really struck me that actually, again, it's why I focus on the questioning, the listening, the storytelling. If you get this right, the purchase, they become the buyer as opposed to you become the seller. But there is a time when you still have to sort of help them across that line, that you do need to ask that question. And I think there's a couple of things. When they say no, it means no right now in a sort of the sales context. It's not a rejection. It's just there's something that hasn't been answered for them. They're still got something that needs to be addressed. And so we apply what I call, or what's called the objection handling technique. But actually by following that through, again, it's very authentic, it's very eloquent, it's not salesy. It's about, they've said no, let me understand why they've said no. And I remember when I first taught this, and the patient care coordinator actually phoned me up and said, I've applied it, it worked. And the customer, it was a guy, sat down and said, look, I'm not buying today. I'm not going to sign up. I need to go away and think about it. And so she applied the technique, totally agree. This is a big decision, nor should you make the decision today, but followed the technique, understood what was the question. It was a question that could be answered, brought the surgeon back in, the physician back in, he answered the question, no pressure, the surgeon left, and he went, okay, here's my card, here's my credit card, this is my preferred date. And it was closed. So again, we sort of have this view of sales, and I don't want to be that person, but this is about helping them on their journey. And part of that is ask them to move forward. What's the next step? When would you like to schedule? And sort of be part of that journey with them.
Selling hope. I absolutely love that. So, Chris, if a practice wants to connect with you and learn more about how you could potentially help them, win patients beyond the consult, how should they go about contacting you?
Easy. The company's Sales MD, all one word. So search for that in Google, salesmd.com. On Instagram, we're SalesMD. Or alternative, just drop me an email, chris@salesmd.com. I'm happy to talk, happy to sort of see where you are and where you want to get to.
Chris, man, thanks for joining us on Coffee and Conversation. I really appreciate it, and we'll talk soon.
Chuck, thank you very much indeed.